You ever seen a man get ignored so completely he might as well not exist? The voice cut through the humid air of the SEAL training gym, sharp with amusement as Petty Officer Ryan Blake leaned against a squat rack, arms crossed, watching the old janitor struggle with a mop and a dented yellow bucket, the fluorescent lights above flickering against polished steel and sweat-darkened rubber mats, the smell of iron and disinfectant hanging thick, and in the middle of it all, Ethan Cole moved slow and deliberate, his worn work boots leaving faint wet tracks as he dragged the mop across the floor like he was tracing a line only he could see, his posture slightly bent but steady, his eyes down, never meeting the stares that followed him like a spotlight. And when Ryan nudged the bucket with his boot, sending a wave of murky water sloshing over the rim and onto the concrete, laughter rippled through the room, light at first, then louder, feeding on itself. The kind of laughter that came easy when no one thought it mattered. But Ethan didn't react. Not with anger, not with surprise, just a small pause in his movement before he adjusted the mop and kept going. Like this moment had already happened 1,000 times before, like it didn't even register anymore. And that silence, that complete lack of resistance, only seemed to irritate Ryan more. "Hey, old man," he called out, pushing off the rack and stepping closer, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who had never been ignored a day in his life. "You missed a spot," he added, gesturing broadly at the clean floor, and a few of the younger trainees snickered behind him, their attention locked on the scene like it was part of the day's training, something to pass the time between sets and drills. But Ethan just nodded once, barely noticeable, and shifted the mop a few inches, his hands steady despite the tremor that came with age. And for a moment, something about that steadiness didn't match the image they had already decided for him. But no one said anything, not yet. Because it was easier to follow the tone that had already been set, easier to laugh than to look closer, and Ryan stepped in again. Closer this time, his shadow cutting across Ethan's path. "You even know where you are?" he asked, his tone light, but edged with something sharper underneath, and Ethan's eyes lifted just slightly, pale blue catching the overhead light for a fraction of a second before dropping again. And that was when it happened, a careless bump from one of the trainees moving past. A shoulder brushing too hard, just enough to shift the old man's balance and tug at the collar of his faded work shirt, the fabric slipping aside for a heartbeat, revealing something dark against the weathered skin of his neck, something that didn't belong in a place like this, a faded shape, ink worn by decades but still unmistakable in its form. And across the room, near the doorway, a senior chief froze mid-step, his gaze snapping toward that mark as if it had called his name. The noise of the gym fading for him alone, his expression tightening just slightly before he turned away, too quickly, reaching for his phone without a word while behind him the laughter continued, unaware that something in the room had just shifted, something none of them could yet see. The laughter lingered, but it no longer filled the room the same way, something subtle shifting beneath it like a current no one could quite name. Ryan still grinning as he watched Ethan straighten the bucket and wring out the mop with slow, practiced motions, the old man's hands steady despite the years etched into them, the faint drip of water echoing in the sudden pockets of silence that began to form between the jokes. And Ryan tilted his head slightly, studying him now with a flicker of curiosity he would never admit. "You move like you have been here before," he said, half mocking, half probing. But Ethan did not answer, not with words, only continuing his work as if the question had dissolved before it ever reached him. And across the gym, the senior chief stepped into the hallway, his voice low and controlled as he spoke into the phone, each word measured, deliberate. "I need you to listen carefully," he said, his eyes fixed on the empty corridor as if the walls themselves were listening. "There is a man here, maintenance staff. Older, maybe late 70s or early 80s, and there is a mark on his neck." A pause, brief but heavy. "Yes, sir. I am certain." Another pause, longer this time, the kind that stretches thin before it snaps. And when the voice on the other end responded, the senior chief's posture straightened instinctively, his tone sharpening. "Understood," he said quietly before ending the call, his hand lingering on the phone for just a second longer than necessary. And back inside, the gym carried on, but not quite the same. The trainees still moving, still lifting, still talking, but their eyes drifting back to Ethan more often now, drawn by something they could not explain, something that did not fit the story they had already written for him. And Ryan stepped closer again, slower this time. His earlier swagger softened by something closer to unease. "Hey," he said, not as loud as before. "What was that on your neck?" The question hanging in the air without the edge it once had. But Ethan only adjusted his grip on the mop and turned slightly, the collar of his shirt settling back into place, the mark hidden once more like it had never been there at all. And for a moment, Ryan hesitated, his instincts pulling in two directions, one telling him to laugh it off, to keep the tone light, to stay in control, the other urging him to look closer, to ask again, to not let it go. But before he could decide, the heavy double doors at the far end of the gym swung open with a force that cut through the room like a blade, and every sound, every movement, every breath seemed to pause as Commander James Rourke stepped inside. His presence immediate and undeniable, his uniform crisp, his expression unreadable, his eyes scanning the room not with curiosity, but with purpose, and the temperature of the space seemed to drop without a single word being spoken, conversations dying mid-sentence, weights lowering quietly back onto racks. And Ryan felt it then, that shift he could no longer ignore, the sudden realization that whatever this was, it was no longer a joke, and the commander did not look at him, did not look at anyone else. His gaze locked onto one man standing alone beside a dented yellow bucket, and as he started walking, slow and direct, the silence deepened until it pressed against every chest in the room. And for the first time that day, Ethan Cole stopped moving. Commander Rourke's boots struck the polished concrete with a steady, measured rhythm, each step echoing louder than it should have in a room that had fallen completely silent, his gaze never wavering as he closed the distance. And Ryan felt his throat tighten, the weight of that silence pressing in from all sides, the kind of silence that did not invite movement, did not allow mistakes. And Ethan stood there beside the bucket, one hand resting lightly on the worn wooden handle of the mop, his posture unchanged except for the smallest shift of his shoulders, as if acknowledging something long expected had finally arrived. And when the commander stopped just a few feet away, he did not speak immediately, did not demand attention or explanation. He simply looked, his eyes tracing the line of Ethan's collar with a precision that felt almost surgical. And then, without warning, he reached out, not roughly, not forcefully, but with absolute certainty, two fingers catching the edge of the faded fabric and pulling it aside just enough to reveal the mark beneath. And the room seemed to hold its breath, every set of eyes locking onto that small, weathered tattoo as if seeing it for the first time. The shape clearer now in the harsh overhead light, the coiled serpent wrapped around a trident, ink faded but deliberate, and something in the commander's expression changed, not dramatically, not in a way that shouted for attention, but in a way that was unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for, his jaw tightening just slightly, his shoulders squaring, his entire posture shifting from inspection to recognition. And for a moment that stretched longer than it should have, he said nothing at all, the silence deepening into something heavier, something that settled over the room like a weight. And Ryan felt it then, a cold realization creeping in, the understanding that whatever joke he thought he was part of had already ended, that he had stepped into something far beyond his control. And then the commander stepped back half a pace, his hand dropping to his side, and in one smooth, deliberate motion, he straightened to full attention, his heels coming together with a sharp, precise click that cut through the silence like a signal, and he raised his hand in a formal salute, held firm, unwavering, directed not at a superior officer in uniform, but at an old man in a worn work shirt standing beside a dented bucket. And the effect was immediate, absolute, the entire room freezing in place, every trainee, every observer caught between disbelief and instinct, because nothing in their training had prepared them for this. Nothing had taught them how to react when the highest authority in the room chose to honor the person they had just dismissed. And Ryan's breath caught in his chest, his earlier confidence collapsing under the weight of what he was seeing, his mind racing to make sense of it, to reconcile the image of the quiet janitor with the reality unfolding in front of him. And Ethan did not return the salute right away. He simply looked at the commander, his pale blue eyes steady, calm, carrying a depth that seemed to stretch far beyond the walls of the gym. And when he finally moved, it was slow, deliberate, his hand rising just enough to acknowledge the gesture before lowering again. And when he spoke, his voice was quiet, rough with age but clear enough to carry across the silent room. "At ease, Commander," he said, as if the words themselves carried weight earned over a lifetime. And the commander lowered his hand immediately, not hesitating, not questioning, his respect unmistakable. And for a moment, no one else moved, no one else spoke, because the world they thought they understood had just shifted in a way they could not yet comprehend. The silence did not break, it stretched, settled, and deepened into something heavier than sound, the kind that made every man in the room suddenly aware of where he stood and who he stood beside, and Ryan Blake felt it pressing against him, tightening around his chest as his eyes moved from the commander back to Ethan Cole, trying to reconcile the man holding a mop with the one who had just been saluted without hesitation, without question, and it did not make sense, not in any way he understood, because respect like that was not given lightly, not here, not in a place where every ounce of it had to be earned the hard way, and yet it had been given instantly, completely, as if it had been waiting for this exact moment to reveal itself, and Ethan, for his part, had already returned to stillness, his hand resting once again on the mop handle, his posture calm, unbothered, as if nothing extraordinary had just happened, as if the room had not just shifted around him, and the commander remained where he stood, his gaze steady, his expression composed but carrying an unmistakable weight, the kind that came from recognition, from memory, from something far deeper than rank or protocol. And when he finally spoke, his voice was lower than before, controlled, deliberate. "I did not expect to find you here," he said, not loudly, but clearly enough that every word carried across the silent gym, and Ethan's eyes lifted slightly, meeting his for a brief moment, a flicker of something passing between them that no one else in the room could fully understand. "I was not expecting to be found," Ethan replied, his voice quiet, almost conversational, but there was a finality to it, a tone that suggested this was not a conversation he had intended to have, not here, not like this. And the commander gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if that answer confirmed something he already knew, something he had suspected the moment he saw the mark. And behind them, the trainees remained frozen, their earlier confidence replaced by uncertainty, by the slow, creeping realization that they had misjudged something important, something they should have recognized. And Ryan swallowed hard, the memory of his own words replaying in his mind with a clarity that made his stomach tighten, each joke, each careless remark now carrying a weight he had not felt before, and he shifted his stance slightly, unsure of where to look, unsure of what to do, because the rules he understood no longer applied, and the commander's attention shifted then, just briefly, his eyes moving across the room, taking in the faces, the posture, the subtle tension that had replaced the earlier ease. And when his gaze passed over Ryan, it did not linger, but it was enough to make Ryan straighten instinctively, his back rigid, his earlier posture gone, replaced by something closer to discipline, something closer to awareness. And then the commander looked back to Ethan, his voice steady. "You should not be doing this," he said, a slight glance toward the bucket, the mop, the worn tools that seemed so out of place now. And Ethan followed his gaze for a moment before looking back up, his expression unchanged. "It is work that needs to be done," he said simply, and there was no trace of irony in his tone, no attempt to deflect or explain, just a statement of fact. And that answer seemed to settle something in the commander, his shoulders easing just slightly, not in relaxation, but in acceptance. And for a moment longer, they stood there, two men bound by something unspoken, something that reached far beyond the walls of the gym. And then, slowly, the world began to move again, not all at once, not loudly, but in small, careful shifts, the kind that followed when everyone knew they had just witnessed something they would not forget, even if they did not yet understand it. The movement returned to the room slowly, like a tide creeping back after being pulled away too far, but nothing felt the same, every motion measured, every glance heavier than before, and Ryan Blake stood where he was, his hands no longer relaxed at his sides, his shoulders drawn tight, as if the weight of the moment had settled directly onto him. And he could feel it now, the shift in how the others looked, not at Ethan, but at him, The unspoken question hanging in the air. How had he not seen it? How had he missed something that the commander recognized in a single glance? And across the floor, Ethan lifted the mop again, dipping it into the bucket with the same steady rhythm, the faint sound of water breaking the silence in a way that felt almost deliberate, grounding, as if reminding the room that despite everything, the work remained, and the commander watched him for a moment longer, his expression unreadable, but his presence still commanding, still anchoring the space in a way no one could ignore. And then he spoke again, quieter this time, but with a weight that carried just as far. "How long have you been here?" he asked, and Ethan paused, not turning immediately, as if measuring the question against something deeper than simple time. "Long enough," he said after a moment, his voice calm, neither defensive nor revealing, just enough to answer without explaining. And the commander gave a slight nod, as if that answer, vague as it was, confirmed something he had already begun to piece together. And behind them, the trainees shifted, the subtle scrape of shoes against concrete breaking through the tension, no one daring to speak, no one willing to disrupt what was unfolding. And Ryan finally moved, just a step forward, hesitation written into the motion, his earlier confidence replaced by something far more uncertain. "Sir," he started, his voice not as steady as he would have liked, and the single word drew the commander's attention, not sharply, but enough to make Ryan straighten instinctively. "I did not realize," he continued, the sentence faltering before it could find its end, because there was no way to finish it that would undo what had already been said, already done. And for a moment, it seemed like the room itself leaned in, waiting to see what would follow. But Ethan did not turn, did not acknowledge the words directly. He simply resumed his motion, the mop gliding across the floor in slow, even strokes. And that silence, that complete lack of reaction, carried more weight than any response could have. And Ryan swallowed hard, the realization settling deeper, that whatever this man was, whatever he had been, it was not something that could be fixed with a quick apology or a change in tone. And the commander watched the exchange without interruption, his gaze steady, his presence reinforcing the lesson without needing to voice it. And then, after a moment that stretched just long enough to leave its mark, he spoke again, this time not to Ryan, but to the room itself. "There are things in this world you do not recognize until it is too late to pretend you understand them," he said, his voice even, carrying across the space with quiet authority, and the words settled into the air, not as a reprimand, but as a truth, something meant to be absorbed rather than argued. And Ethan finished the pass he was making, lifting the mop slightly as he stepped back, the faint sheen of water on the floor catching the overhead light. And for the first time since the commander had entered, he looked out across the room, not at any one person, but at all of them, his gaze steady, calm, carrying no anger, no judgment, just a quiet presence that seemed to hold more than it revealed. And then, just as simply, he lowered his eyes again and continued his work, as if nothing more needed to be said, leaving the weight of everything that had just happened to settle where it would. The gym did not return to normal, not really. It only pretended to. Movements resumed, but slower, quieter, every action carrying a new awareness that had not been there before. And the sound of the mop sliding across the floor became the loudest thing in the room, a steady, rhythmic reminder that the man they had overlooked was still exactly where he had been, unchanged by their realization, unaffected by their sudden shift in attitude. And that was what unsettled them most, not the salute, not the commander's presence, but the fact that Ethan Cole had not changed at all. He had not straightened his posture to match their respect, had not spoken differently, had not claimed anything or corrected anyone. He simply continued, and that quiet consistency carried more weight than any display of authority ever could. And Commander Rourke remained nearby, not hovering, not interfering, but present in a way that reinforced everything without needing to repeat it, his eyes occasionally drifting back to Ethan, as if confirming something each time he looked, and then to the rest of the room, measuring, observing. And Ryan felt that gaze again, not directly, but enough to keep him aware, enough to remind him that this moment was not over, that there was still something to be understood. And he found himself stepping closer once more, not out of confidence this time, but out of something else, something quieter, something closer to respect. or maybe the beginning of it. And he stopped a few feet away, careful now, aware of the space he occupied, aware of the man in front of him in a way he had not been before. "Sir," he said again, the word different this time. Not forced, not performative, but deliberate, and Ethan paused just slightly, not turning fully, just enough to acknowledge the sound, and Ryan hesitated, searching for the right words, finding none that felt sufficient, none that could undo what had already been said. And in that hesitation, he realized something important, that this was not about fixing a mistake, it was about understanding it, and Ethan seemed to sense that shift, because when he spoke, his voice was the same as it had always been, calm, steady, carrying no edge. "You do not need to explain," he said, and the words landed softly but firmly, removing the need for apology, removing the expectation of correction, and leaving only the lesson itself. And Ryan exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing just slightly, not because the moment had passed, but because it had settled into something clearer, something he could carry forward. And across the room, a few of the trainees began to move again, not loudly, not carelessly, but with a different kind of focus, their eyes no longer dismissive, no longer casual, but attentive, aware, and the shift spread quietly, one person at a time, until the entire gym carried a new tone, one that had not been ordered, had not been enforced, but had simply emerged, and the commander watched it happen, his expression unchanged but his posture easing just enough to signal that what needed to happen had already begun. And then, after a moment, he turned slightly, his voice low but carrying. "Training resumes," he said, and the words broke the final layer of stillness, not abruptly, but with purpose, and the room responded, not with the loose energy from before, but with a controlled, deliberate motion, each man returning to his station with a quiet awareness that would not fade quickly. And Ethan dipped the mop once more, wrung it out with practiced ease, and continued across the floor, leaving behind a clean surface that reflected the overhead lights in a steady, unbroken line, as if nothing had ever disrupted it at all. The rhythm of the gym settled into something controlled and deliberate, the sharp clank of weights no longer careless but measured, each movement carrying an awareness that had not existed an hour ago, and Ryan Blake felt it in every motion he made, the weight of his own actions still lingering in the back of his mind, shaping the way he stood, the way he spoke, even the way he breathed. And across the polished floor, Ethan Cole continued his quiet work, the mop gliding in smooth arcs that left behind a clean, reflective surface, the overhead lights stretching across it in long, unbroken lines. And there was something about that reflection that caught Ryan's attention now, something he had never noticed before, the way Ethan moved, not hurried, not slow, but precise, as if every step had already been measured long before it was taken, and it did not match the image of a man simply doing a job. It felt practiced, intentional, and the more Ryan watched, the more he realized that nothing about this man was accidental, not the way he held the mop, not the way he shifted his weight, not even the way he seemed to disappear into the background while still somehow commanding the space around him. And that realization settled deeper than any lecture could have, because it was not being told to him. It was unfolding in front of him, piece by piece, and Commander Rourke remained near the edge of the floor, his presence quieter now, but no less significant, his eyes moving between the trainees and Ethan, observing not just their actions, but the change in them, the subtle corrections, the sharper focus, the absence of careless behavior. And for a moment, his gaze rested on Ryan again, not with judgment, but with expectation, the kind that did not need to be spoken, and Ryan felt it, straightening slightly, adjusting his stance without thinking, his movements aligning more closely with the discipline he had been taught, but had not fully understood until now. And as the training continued, the sounds of effort filled the room again, controlled breathing, the steady rhythm of repetition, the quiet commands passed between teammates. But underneath it all, there was a new layer, a shared awareness that something important had been revealed, something that could not be ignored. And Ethan moved past one group, then another, his presence barely acknowledged outwardly but clearly felt, the trainees giving him space without being told, their eyes tracking him for just a moment longer than necessary, before returning to their tasks. And in that space, in that unspoken adjustment, Respect had taken root, not loudly, not dramatically, but firmly, and Ryan found himself stepping aside as Ethan approached, not out of obligation, but out of understanding, his earlier behavior replaced by something quieter, something more deliberate, and Ethan nodded once as he passed, a small gesture, almost imperceptible, but enough to confirm that the shift had been noticed, that it mattered, and Ryan returned. The nod without thinking, the motion natural, unforced, and in that brief exchange, something settled between them, not forgiveness, not explanation, but recognition, and across the room, the commander turned slightly, watching it happen, his expression unchanged but his posture easing just enough to suggest that what needed to be learned was being learned, not through orders, not through correction, but through experience. And as the session continued, the gym no longer felt like a place where someone could be overlooked. Not anymore. Because once something like this was seen, truly seen, it could not be unseen, and Ethan Cole continued his work, quiet, steady, leaving behind nothing but a clean floor and a lesson that would remain long after the water dried. Time stretched in a different way now, not slow, not fast, but deliberate, every second carrying weight as the gym moved in quiet synchronization. And Ethan Cole reached the far end of the floor where the light from the high windows cut across the polished concrete in long, pale strips, dust drifting lazily in the air above it. And he paused there for just a moment, not out of fatigue, but as if measuring something only he could see, his hand resting lightly on the worn handle of the mop, the same way it might rest on something far more familiar from a different time. And across the room, Ryan Blake noticed it, that stillness, that brief pause that felt intentional rather than necessary. And for reasons he could not fully explain, he found himself watching more closely than before, his earlier assumptions completely gone, replaced by a quiet focus that sharpened everything he saw. And Ethan moved again, turning slightly as he worked back across the floor, and as he passed beneath the light, the collar of his shirt shifted just enough for the edge of that faded mark to catch the glow again. And this time no one laughed, no one commented, the room simply absorbed it, the presence of it settling deeper into their awareness. And near the doorway, Commander Rourke stepped aside, allowing Ethan to pass without interruption, his posture no longer rigid, but still precise, his respect unchanged. And as Ethan moved by, the commander spoke again, not loudly, but clearly enough that the words carried. There are names attached to marks like that, he said, his gaze steady. Names that are not written down, not recorded, not spoken unless they have to be. And Ethan did not stop, did not turn, but there was the slightest shift in his expression, something almost like acknowledgement, almost like memory, before it settled back into the same calm stillness. And Ryan felt a chill run through him at those words, the realization deepening, that whatever this man had been part of existed beyond the structure he understood, beyond ranks and visible honors. Something quieter, something hidden, and yet somehow more respected than anything openly displayed, and the trainees around him seemed to feel it too, their movement steady but their attention sharper, their awareness fixed on the unspoken truth that had entered the room and refused to leave. And Ethan reached the center again, dipping the mop. Once more, the water rippling softly as he wrung it out, the sound clear in the otherwise controlled environment. And for a moment, the entire space seemed to revolve around that simple action, the ordinary task, that now carried an entirely different meaning. And Ryan stepped forward again, not to interrupt, not to challenge, but simply to stand a little closer, to understand just a little more. And he noticed then the small details he had missed before, the way Ethan's grip never slipped, the way his posture adjusted subtly with each movement, the way his eyes tracked the floor with a focus that felt almost tactical. And it struck him then, fully, that nothing about this man was accidental, not even this, not even the act of cleaning a floor. And across the room, Commander Rourke watched in silence, his presence no longer commanding attention, but reinforcing something deeper, something that had already taken hold. And as Ethan continued his quiet work, the gym remained in motion around him. But the perspective had shifted completely, because now every man in that room understood, in a way they had not before, that greatness did not always arrive announced, and sometimes the most important things were the ones that chose not to be seen at all. The last stretch of the floor gleamed under the overhead lights, a smooth, reflective surface that carried no trace of what had been there before, and Ethan Cole slowed his movement as he reached the edge, lifting the mop slightly and letting the remaining drops fall back into the bucket with a soft, measured rhythm. And for a moment, he simply stood there, not looking at anyone, not seeking acknowledgement, just taking in the quiet that had settled across the room. And it was a different kind of quiet now, not forced, not tense, but respectful, deliberate, the kind that came when something important had been understood without needing to be explained. And across the gym, the trainees moved through their routines with a focus that had sharpened, their voices lower, their actions more precise, each man aware of the presence that had changed the tone of the space. And Ryan Blake stood near the center, his posture steady, his eyes following Ethan not with curiosity anymore, but with recognition, the kind that did not need confirmation. And when Ethan began to wheel the bucket toward the exit, the path ahead of him cleared without a word, each man stepping aside just slightly, not in a dramatic gesture, not in a show of deference, but in a quiet acknowledgement that felt more genuine than anything forced. And as he passed Ryan, there was a brief moment where their eyes met again, and this time there was no hesitation, no uncertainty. Ryan gave a small, deliberate nod, and Ethan returned it just as simply, the exchange brief but complete, carrying more meaning than any apology could have held. And near the doorway, Commander Rourke stood waiting, not blocking the way, not commanding attention, just present. And as Ethan approached, the commander straightened once more, not as sharply as before, but with the same unmistakable respect. And for a second, it seemed as if something more might be said, something that could give shape to everything that had been left unspoken. But Ethan paused only long enough to meet his gaze, his expression calm, steady, carrying that same quiet weight. And then he spoke, his voice low but clear. "Take care of them," he said, a simple sentence, but one that carried far beyond its words. And the commander nodded immediately, without hesitation. "Yes, sir," he replied, the response automatic, earned, and final. And Ethan gave a slight nod in return before stepping past him, the bucket wheels rolling softly against the floor as he moved toward the exit, his figure gradually blending into the brighter light of the hallway beyond. And for a moment longer, the room remained still, every eye tracking that quiet departure, until the door swung closed behind him with a soft, almost unnoticed sound. And only then did the gym fully exhale, the tension easing but not disappearing, because what had settled there would not leave so easily. And Ryan looked down at the floor, at the clean, reflective surface that stretched out before him. And for the first time, he saw more than just a place to train. He saw the imprint of something greater, something that did not need recognition to exist. And across the room, the commander turned back to his men, his voice steady, controlled. "Remember what you saw today," he said, not loudly, but with enough weight to carry. "Respect is not given to rank alone." And the words settled in, not as an order, but as a truth. And no one questioned it. No one spoke, because they had already seen it for themselves. And as the training resumed once more, there was no trace of the earlier arrogance, no careless laughter, only focus, discipline, and a quiet understanding that would stay with them long after the floor dried and the day ended. Because some lessons did not need to be repeated, they only needed to be witnessed once to last a lifetime.